Hi, my name is Charlie Easterling, and I'm an assistant professor of biology here at Northwest University. You're listening to 10-Minute Tips podcast, where today we're going to work on part 2, actually, of this series. If you missed part 1, it was talking about how do we actually kind of hone in and start those study skills. In part 2, what we're going to focus on, what are the actual best practices and different ways that a person can study. So let's go ahead. Now, I want to reiterate something that I said in part 1, which is basically that different things work for different people, and that is okay. So know that just because something really works for your friend, maybe it doesn't work for you, and there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that you learn in different ways. Many students are used to the idea that either you're more of a visual learner, an auditory learner, or kinesthetic learner. But it's not just the way that you learn things actually in class, it's actually how you interact with those materials outside of class too and actually work on your studying. So, all right, well, what do we do when we actually set aside that study time and sit down to work on the material? So again, I'm going to reiterate and keep pushing this idea of you need to find what works for you as an individual. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't study with other people, but make sure you are using methods that actually are personally working for you and not just because you think they're working for everyone else better. Probably the easiest thing that you can do when it comes to studying is simply rereading over your notes. Now, you can kind of change this up in a certain way of maybe you just read over them just silently to yourself, or maybe you take some time to read your notes out loud. Being able to read those sentences out loud to yourself will help people, especially if you're more of an auditory learner. For other people, instead of rereading the notes, maybe that takes into account of you're actually going to re-listen to the lecture and have your notes in front of you at that time. Those are just ways of repeating that raw information that you got the first time around. Where this can be really helpful and beneficial to students is it's something that they're familiar with. It's something that you just actively participated in not too long ago if we're studying early and often. So being able to go back to that source material can serve as a source of comfort for students. Now, the next bits that I'm going to talk about are going to be different ways that you could potentially study. Please do not feel like you need to do all of these for a single class. You might find that one thing works for one class, like an English course, and then maybe you'll find that one of your science courses needs you to use actually a different study method. So you can kind of mix and match, pick and choose which of these things you might think for you, or might think works for you. But what I want you to actually do is kind of think through and maybe try some of these methods. Know that you can also tailor them and edit them along the way to see kind of what actually is working for you, again, as an individual. So one thing that I've noticed that a lot of students like to do more recently is they like to rewrite their notes. Some of my students like to say that they've got their sloppy copy, which was the original part that they took in class, and then they move it over to their pretty copy in their notebook. Now, you can do this in a typical fashion where literally you just take the notes and rewrite them another time. I've had students too, since in my classes I provide my PowerPoint notes before the class starts, and sometimes they'll actually go and write out all of the PowerPoint notes for themselves beforehand and then come to class adding in my notes that I actually say in addition to those things, and then copy the whole thing over again. Now, that's a lot of time and dedication, so if that seems overwhelming to you, don't worry. But if it is something that might work for you, keep it in mind. When you're rewriting your notes, it might not just be in the way of copying from one notebook to another. It could be in different forms. Maybe you're using something like flashcards. Now, you could write flashcards in the standard sense where you're writing maybe a word on the front and the definition on the back, or you could turn your flashcards into questions for yourself. And so you could write the question out in full on the front and the question answer on the back all the way out in full. And really what you're doing is you're actually going line by line in your notes to come up with these questions for yourself. It's a different way of rewriting what you previously went through. If you're somebody who doesn't necessarily want to use flashcards or paper or anything like that, what you can do is some students really go towards Quizlet. Quizlet works really great if you're good at learning things online. I know for me personally, I have a harder time with retention there, so it doesn't necessarily work for me, and I would stick to traditional flashcards. But again, it's up to the individual. With Quizlet, you can use your own. You can collaborate, though, with other students, or you can even go through and kind of look for alternative questions that maybe other people have asked in a similar topic. The good thing about Quizlet for a lot of people is that you can easily access it on things like your phone instead of having to worry about carrying paper with you. Sometimes people might also take their notes that they originally wrote in class, and when they rewrite them, they actually change the format so that maybe originally you were just trying to hastily copy down everything that was being said and written on the board, but when you go to rewrite things, you actually reorganize the notes in a way that works for you, and that might be in something like a bulleted list or something like that instead. Or some students that are more into kind of drawing what's going on might actually redraw diagrams that happened. And again, this is all just kind of copying back over, rewriting the things that you actually previously saw in class. Another thing that can work is reading the material out loud to yourself or writing the slides again before lecture. What this does is when you're reading through the material before you actually come to class, you're priming and setting your brain up for the things that are going to come in that next lecture. That's going to require some forethought on you as a student to basically make sure you're showing up to class knowing already what kind of in part is going to be talked about, but don't feel pressured that you need to actually understand all the material. That's what your instructor is there to help you do, but maybe you just start to pick up on certain key words that you know are going to come up in the class, and so they're not as much of a surprise or are not as new to you. So your brain is already a little bit thinking about what that material is, and you're not just starting off kind of cold turkey with what's all happening. When it comes to kind of working with others on your studying, some students love study groups, and I think study groups can be really, really great. However, be warned that study groups can also be very distracting. So if you notice that you and your friends are spending the first 30 minutes of your study session talking about what was on TV the night before, maybe either think about working with another group of students or set aside different times where you're going to say, okay, we're going to have an hour-long study session. The first 30 minutes, we're going to study. And the second 30 minutes, we're going to get to talk about whatever was on that TV show last night. And really kind of hold yourselves to that structured guideline. Know that maybe you need to change up who your study groups are. Maybe your study groups would need to be just with one other person, or some people might work better in a group of 5. Again, kind of varies depending on the personalities and the people that you're working with. Benefits of study groups, though, is that it normally allows you to teach someone else the material. And people normally feel more comfortable when they're teaching other humans what's going on. It's a real kind of good trick and tip that if you're able to teach the material to someone else, then you very quickly know what information you're able to retain and what information you might need to actually go back and look at some more. Though, if you're able to get through some kind of teaching lesson flawlessly, then 1, props to you, but 2, you've also really got a handle on that material. So what I would suggest for study groups is maybe that's not the way you first start studying, but as you get closer to the exam, maybe that's when you need to pick up those study groups and start actually teaching and describing material to another person. Now, what about if you don't want to work in a group, but you still want that benefit of teaching? Well, good news for you. God is always willing to listen. And so you could even just take up in an empty room, whether it's on campus or at home, and just start talking about the material and the topics out loud. It might start to feel a little bit silly, but by forming those actual words, it gets you to think about the material more than if you just kind of run it through the material in your head in silent. Know that there are plenty of resources around campus for you to use, and there's plenty of rooms with whiteboards so that you can also kind of jot down things and actually act like you're a teacher showing somebody else this material. The other thing is asking questions at office hours. Your professors here at NU are absolutely here to help you as much as possible, and use our office hours to your advantage. So if you have questions, feel free to come into office hours and actually ask those things. And the earlier the better, so that you actually are understanding the material all along the way. If you're a little bit hesitant to go into office hours, maybe an email is less daunting, or you could even try asking a friend that's in the class. As far as other things that you can use to aid in your studying, maybe you use things like the websuits Kahoot.com. This allows you to kind of create these polls or even little questions or quizzes where you have to think a little bit on your feet. Kahoots can be really great to use for study groups as well to help keep you organized, as you can always launch the Kahoot on a computer and then play along on your phones. Things like YouTube videos are always a great resource as well. There's tons of educational resources available on YouTube, and it helps give you the information in a different way. And sometimes it might be a little bit fun to watch things like a cartoon explaining that same exact concept that you had your professor explaining to you. And always going to your textbook can be a help and benefit as you're getting that raw information just again over and over, and it really helps kind of understand and maybe go into concepts a little bit deeper than what your professor was able to go through in the limited time in class. Again, these are just a couple of ideas of things that you can actually do in your studying, but know that there are plenty more options that I'm not able to cover in a quick 10 minutes, but I hope that they do help. And make sure you listen to parts 1 and 2 if you want to get the full breadth of information.